Next question. This is from Clay, who writes, I've been enjoying your video series. Confessional Lutherans seem to have a deep regard for the Eucharist. Is it common among such Lutherans to participate in adoration of the Blessed Sacrament? Is this question a matter of controversy? Well, thank you, Clay, for the question here. By the way, I think this is really interesting. Is that one of the things that's happened in the last few weeks since we've been putting our services online? So we've been recording services, Matin service, so not a divine service, like a Matin service or evening prayer or whatever, here at St. Paul Lutheran Church, and posting them up on the St. Paul webpage. But there's something that happened, and that is that before that on YouTube, I got the YouTube thing happening, and there's all these Roman Catholic trolls who were all over the YouTube page talking about how Lutherans don't have the supper and we don't have the right office and everything, and they still are doing that kind of thing. But they saw the liturgy, and they saw me investments at the altar and candles and everything, and they're like, "Wow, you Lutherans have kept a lot of the Catholic stuff." To which I wanted to respond, "Well, you guys have kept a lot of the Lutheran stuff," but I actually responded, "Thank you." But it's interesting. I think it's very interesting if you were to just ask a Catholic what they imagined happened inside the Lutheran churches, in their imagination, it's probably a lot like a Pentecostal service. And then they come and they're like, whoa. In fact, it's one of the problems is that when someone like from an evangelical church or from a Baptist church comes and visits the Lutheran church, and they're like, well, your guys are just like the Catholics. Well, I mean, we say the creeds and we have the liturgy. You remember how we got kicked out of the Catholic Church? Remember how we got anathematized by Trent and everything? I mean, we're not. Anyway, I guess the outward looks a lot to people. And one of the marks is that we have a high regard for the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. In fact, the Lutherans maintain the elevation. So after the words of institution are spoken, the words taken from the Gospels of Jesus from the night when he was betrayed, he took bread, he broke it, he gave thanks, he said, "Take and eat, this is my body." When those words are spoken, after they're spoken, that the pastor will take the chalice and the host, the bread, so the body and the blood, and hold it up before the people, and say the Pax, the peace of the Lord be with you always. It's held up. In fact, some Lutheran pastors, including myself, this is one of the changes that I've brought to the churches where I've come, is that after I speak the words of institution, after I speak the words consecrating the bread, and now the Lord's body is there, and likewise with the wine and the Lord's blood is there, I'll genuflect, I'll kneel as an act of reverence and adoration to Jesus, who is present according to his body and his blood for us to eat and drink. And so it is a practice that seems really quite something. In fact, the Lutheran Church the Lutherans traditionally have a very high reverence for the true body and blood in the supper, evidenced by the fact that most of the time, the way the Lord's body and blood is distributed in the Lutheran Church is to people who are kneeling. So you come up and you kneel and you receive it that way. It's a big question about how the Lord's body and blood is received in the Catholic Church. And again, I'm no expert on this, and there's probably some controversy, but a lot of times in the Catholic Church, you'll just do the drive-by. You'll just walk by and receive. Now, it's still the body and blood and so forth, but the posture of your body is a confession of what's going on there. And the Lutherans will kneel to receive the body and the blood. So in one way, the Lutheran Church has kept the adoration of the Eucharist, the adoration, we should say it like this, the adoration of Jesus, who is present according to his body and his blood. But in another very profound way, the Lutherans have rejected that, the practice of Eucharistic adoration. The Catholic Church has this, they will take the consecrated host and reserve it in the tabernacle and put it there on the altar, and you have the fancy stuff, and they'll light a candle to indicate that the consecrated host is there. And then the practice is to come and be before the consecrated host and to pray certain prayers and meditate and so forth and adore the consecrated host. Lutherans do not do that. In fact, they looked at that practice and they said, no. We do not think that is a valid practice at all. And why? I want to read you because whenever you're asking a question about the Lord's Supper, The Lutherans are always pressing straight back to the words of Jesus, straight back to the words of institution. And I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs, I think, if we have time, from the Formula of Concord. Now, what is that? If you remember that the Lutherans were always being asked, what is it that you guys believe? And so they were writing down the things that they believed. And so the big one was the Augsburg Confession, 1530. You got the catechisms, large and small. You have the small called articles, which was written in preparation for a council that never happened. And Luther died, and there was a bunch of fights that broke out over theology in the Lutheran Church. And so to settle those, the theologians got together, and they wrote what's called the Formula of Concord, a formula of unity that takes up a number of these questions. And in that, Article 7 talks about the Lord's Supper. Now, it might be maybe not surprising for students of church history to consider that the Lord's Supper was one of the biggest fights that was happening, because it was happening on two fronts. The Lutherans were fighting the Catholic Church on this side, and the Sacramentarians and the Zwinglians and the others, the Reformed, on that side. So it was a battle on two sides. They were punching in two different directions. And in fact, because of that, Luther wrote more about the Lord's Supper than any other topic that he ever wrote about. I mean, that was a huge part of his life and his debates. I was reading this glorious book, J. Gresham Machen, about Christianity and liberalism, written in 1922. It's a classic book. It is glorious. But he starts talking about how Luther was just wrong about the Lord's Supper. He's a Presbyterian, Machen is, I think, and a Princeton guy, and so he has to say that Luther's wrong about that. Although he does say he's grateful that Luther still cared. So he says it would have been wrong for Luther to say, to Zwingli, we disagree, but it doesn't matter. So it's good that Luther stood and fight. So at least he has appreciation for it. But this is always the claim, is that Luther didn't go far enough. Well, he had plenty of opportunity. I mean, everybody had their hooks in Luther, and they were trying to drag him over to the Reformed camp, to the Sacramentarian camp, and he simply wouldn't do it. And he wouldn't do it because of the words, "This is my body." In fact, that was one of his most famous treatises. That these words, "This is my body," still stand true against the fanatics. And from Luther, and it's kind of a simple theological point, but from Luther, it always goes back to, what does Jesus say? So let me read this. This is answering, what question am I answering? Oh yeah, the Lutherans and the adoration of the sacrament. It says, let us come to the second point, which little mention has been made, to preserve this true Christian doctrine concerning the Holy Supper, and to avoid and abolish manifold idolatrous abuses and perversions of this New Testament. The following useful rule and standard has been derived from the words of institution. Has a little Latin here, which is translated, nothing has the nature of a sacrament apart from the use instituted by Christ. I mean, I know that's what it says because it has the English next to it, so I'm not translating. One time I translated some Latin. In fact, Pastor Mark Taylor, God bless Mark Taylor. What a great man. When I was on vicarage, he tried to teach me Latin, and it didn't work. So one day, a few years later, I found Luther's introduction to Psalm 22, which had never been translated in English, at least that we could find. And so it was in Latin, and so I translated it, and I sent Mark, I said, hey, could you just look over my translation? And he wrote back, and he says, the proper translation is attached. Never translate Latin again. So just being obedient to my teacher. But this is the point. The rule here is that nothing has the nature of a sacrament apart from the use instituted by Christ. And then second, that it is not the sacrament apart from the action divinely instituted. If the institution of Christ be not observed as he appointed it, then there is no sacrament. This rule is by no means to be rejected, and can and should be urged and maintained with profit to the Church of God. And the use or the action appointed by Jesus here does not mean chiefly faith that we believe, or simply the oral participation, but the entire external visible action of the Lord's Supper instituted by Christ. The consecration, the words of institution, the distribution, the reception, the oral partaking, the manducation, and of the consecrated bread and wine, and the partaking of the body and blood of Christ. Apart from this use, when in the papistic mass the bread is not distributed but offered up or enclosed or borne about and exhibited for adoration, is to be regarded as no sacrament, just as the water of baptism was used to consecrate bells or to cure leprosy or otherwise exhibit for worship is not the sacrament or baptism. Against such papistic abuses, the rule has been set up from the beginning of the reviving the gospel and has been explained by Dr. Luther himself. Now, what's interesting, and so to kind of wind down on this point, is to say that what did Jesus say? Jesus says, take and eat. This is my body. Jesus said, take and drink. This is the blood of the New Testament, which is poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. And so the use for which Jesus has instituted the Lord's Supper is not adoration, but it is rather the eating and drinking and believing. It's really, really quite wonderful. So that the Lutheran Church rejects the practice of the alone adoration of the sacrament. And we understand that adoration is simply the recognition of faith that this is, in fact, the true body and blood of Jesus according to his word that's being given to us for the forgiveness of all of our sins. So that the adoration is connected to the eating and to the drinking, never disconnected, always connected to the eating and drinking and to the believing of the promise. That's how we take it. There's more here. This is, again, Solid Declaration, Article 7. I read paragraphs 85 to 86. It goes on to talk about here. I'm going to run out of time. Yeah. So your homework is to go and study that yourself. So I hope, Clay, that this is helpful for you and that we want to have the highest view of the Lord's Supper, but the view that accords with the words which Jesus gave.